It all started on a bright, deceptively calm morning in
This
the
is
suburban
completely
lake community
unacceptable. I
that
warned you about
HOA
the
Karen
consequences.
proudly
You were supposed to
claimed
handle
to
this, and now look at the mess
own,
we're in.
in spirit if not legally. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and the lake's surface mirrored the sky with a kind of serene perfection that made the whole neighborhood look like a postcard. On any other days, I might have admired the views, but this was no ordinary day. Today, I was the target of a relentless HOA crusader who had decided that my life should revolve around her rules, her opinions, and her meticulously manicured lawns. I had moved to this part of town only a few months ago. It wasn't my dream location, but I had found a property that suited my needs perfectly. Privacy, access to the city, and most importantly, freedom. Freedom from meddling neighbors. Freedom from intrusive rules. Freedom from people who felt their opinion entitled them to dictate how I lived my life. Little did I know, freedom was exactly what HOA Karen could not tolerate. Karen was the kind of person who greeted everyone with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was impeccably dressed, every strand of her hair in place, every pearl necklace polished to perfection, and every syllable she uttered carefully measured. But behind that pristine exterior was a force of intimidation. A woman who had spent years climbing the social ladder of HOA hierarchies, attending every board meeting, and volunteering for committees that gave her the power to meddle in neighbors' affairs. To her, they, neighbor, wasn't a person. It was a project, an extension of her control. I first ran into Karen at the community entrance. I had noticed her staring at my house the moment I drove in, clipboard in hand, making notes with an intensity that made it feel like my property had been under investigation. I waved politely, but her eyes narrowed. That was the first red flag. The first hint that my existence in this neighborhood might not be welcomed with the kind of neighborly warmth one might expect. The confrontation came quicker than I anticipated. A week after moving in, Karen appeared at my doors. She carried herself with an air of authority that immediately set off alarms in my mind. "Welcome to our communities," she said, the words dripping with what I would later recognize as territorial venom. "I just wanted to check that you're aware of all the HOA rules." I smiled, thinking she was just being neighborly, trying to ease tension in the first encounter. But her next words made it clear she had a very different agenda. "And I also wanted to remind you that everyone who lives near the lake agrees to participate in our lakefront initiatives. It's part of the community spirit. Of course, some exceptions can be made, but you wouldn't want to be that kind of neighbor, would you?" I paused. The word seemed harmless at first, but there was an unmistakable edge in her tone. This wasn't a friendly welcome. It was a test, a subtle attempt to assert control, to see if I would bend to her vision of conformity. "I appreciate the information," I replied cautiously. "I'll take a look at the HOA guidelines and see how I can get involved." Karen's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Though, you will get involved," she said, almost as if it were a promise, not a suggestion. And with that, she left, leaving me unsettled. Over the next few days, Karen escalated her efforts. Flyers appeared under my door, not in the usual friendly welcome manners, but like notices, each one carefully highlighting required participation in the Lake HOA's events and obligations. She called the property management office repeatedly, asking if I had submitted forms, if I had paid fees, if I had signed up for committees. Every interaction felt orchestrated to remind me that I was being watched. Then came the ultimatums. It was a Tuesday afternoon when she showed up again, this time armed with documents, a tablet, and an air of undeniable
This is
determination.
completely
"We've
unacceptable. I
noticed you
warned
haven't
you about the
officially
consequences. You were
committed to
supposed to
moving
handle
into
this,
our
and
Lake
now look at the mess
HOA,"
we're in.
she announced before I could even greet her. "It's really important for all residents near the water to participate fully. Living here without complying, well, that's not ideal. It disrupts the community balance." I tried to remain calm, measured, knowing that any sign of nervousness would be a victory for her. I respect the community, Karen, I said, but I also value my privacy. I have no plans to relocate or submit myself to any rules beyond those legally required. Her eyes narrowed, and the air seemed to thicken. Privacy is fine, she said, each word carefully weighed. But we have standards here, standards that must be met. You need to understand that being part of our lake community is not optional. You're as expected. At that moment, I realized that expected was her euphemism for mandatory, and that the friendly neighborhood pretense was gone. What stood before me was a person who believed she had the power to dictate not just behavior, but living arrangements. Her voice, calm yet firm, carried the weight of someone who genuinely believed noncompliance was an offense punishable by social exclusion or worse. I decided to stand my ground. Karen, I am happy to follow the rules that are legal and binding, I said firmly. But beyond that, my decisions about where I live and how I live them are mine. I won't be coerced into relocating to a specific part of the neighborhood or joining a committee I have no interest in. Her response was almost theatrical. She placed her clipboard on my front porch, tapping it for emphasis. You're remaking this more difficult than it needs to be. I don't want to escalate this. But if you refuse, we will have to consider further actions to ensure compliance. Her tone implied consequences, though she left them deliberately vague. I could see her strategy unfolding clearly now. The flyers, the calls, the surprise visits, they were all part of a campaign designed to intimidate, to wear me down, to make me feel unwelcome unless I submitted. She believed that by creating discomfort, I would eventually yield to her demands. But I wasn't about to. I had dealt with overbearing authority figures before, and I knew the key was to stay composed and assert boundaries clearly. I didn't rise to her bait. I didn't react emotionally. I simply listened, noted her points, and responded calmly, making it clear that while I respected the community, I was not obligated to meet her personal vision of perfection. For Karen, this was a shock. Most people, in her experience, complied immediately. They nodded, agreed, and participated just to avoid her scrutiny. But here I was, standing firm, smiling politely, and refusing to be intimidated. I could see the momentary flicker of doubt in her eyes, the kind of uncertainty that comes when someone realizes their usual tactics aren't working. And that's when she dropped the final piece of the ultimatum. If you continue to resist, she said, leaning slightly closer as if to whisper, I may have to involve law enforcement to ensure everyone is following the rules. That's how seriously we take compliance here. Her words were sharp, calculated, and designed to make my stomach tighten. But I didn't flinch. I had anticipated this, prepared for it, and I knew that her threat, though intimidating, was mostly empty, at least for the moment. I nodded, maintaining a neutral expression. Understood, I replied, my tone calm, almost conversational. But I am confident that I am within my rights. I won't be forced into any community decision beyond what's legally required. Karen's lips pressed together, and for a moment, the air between us crackled with tension. It was a classic standoff. Her power of perceived authority versus my knowledge of my own rights. She had assumed I would cave. But here I was, unmoved, unshaken, standing my ground. Finally, she sighed, as if disappointed not in me, but in the sheer improbability of encountering someone immune to her usual manipulation tactics. We'll see how this unfolds, she said stiffly, adjusting her perfectly ironed blouse. Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving me with a mixture of relief and anticipation. Relief that the confrontation had ended for now, and anticipation of what her next move might be. Little did Karen know, her ultimatum had just set the stage for a far more dramatic confrontation. She had introduced the idea of escalation, of external enforcement, without realizing that the very person she was threatening had a badge one that would completely flip the power dynamic in ways she couldn't imagine. And as I watched her retreat down the street, I began to prepare for the inevitable moment when the true authority in this story would reveal itself. The HOA ultimatum was more than a request. It was a test, a challenge to see if I would bend to social pressure, veer tactics, and overstepped boundaries. And I had passed the first round with composure, strategy, and an unwavering commitment to my own autonomy. What Karen didn't know was that her next steps would meet not resistance, but a response she would never forget, a revelation that would turn her intimidation into shock, confusion, and, ultimately, defeat. After the HOA ultimatum, I thought the confrontation with Karen might simmer down. But anyone who knows HOA drama knows it never truly ends, it only escalates. Karen was not the kind of person to accept no as an answer. If anything, my calm, firm response only fueled her sense of entitlement and determination. By Thursday morning, she had moved on to her next strategy, involving the police. It started subtly. I noticed a car parked across the street, its engine idling, and the unmistakable look of two officers quietly observing the neighborhood. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, a routine patrol, but when I saw them glance toward my driveway more than once, I knew this was connected to Karen. She had finally decided that subtle intimidation wasn't enough. Now she wanted the authority of the law on her side. I had barely begun my day when my doorbell rang. Standing there, clipboard in hand, was Karen herself, a mixture of indignation and triumph written all over her perfectly composed face. Behind her, I could just make out the familiar silhouettes of the police officers, looking uncomfortable and slightly unsure, as if they weren't entirely certain why they had been called. "Good mornings," Karen said, voice syrupy but sharp, as if sweetness could disguise aggression. "I thought it would be helpful to have the authorities here to ensure everything is in order regarding your residence in our Lake HOA. I blinked, processing the statement. The audacity of it was astonishing. She had called the cops over. What exactly? My refusal to join a homeowners association that had no legal claim over my property. It was almost laughable if it weren't so brazen. "Officers," I said, stepping forward calmly. "Welcome. Can I help you with something?" I made sure to maintain eye contact, projecting confidence and control. It was important to set the tone immediately. This was my property, my rules, and I wasn't going to be intimidated. Karen interjected before the officers could speak. "This resident has refused to comply with community regulations. We thought it best to have the police present to clarify expectations and ensure compliance." She delivered this line like a practice script, as if she had rehearsed it in front of her mirror for days. The officers exchanged glances, the kind of look people give when they realize they've been dragged into a situation they don't fully understand. One of them stepped forward. "Ma'am, can you clarify what specific laws have been violated here?" Karen's smile faltered ever so slightly. She had expected compliance, not questions. "Well, it's the HOA rules. Living in this lakefront community comes with responsibilities. And she pointed at me, has not agreed to participate in our committees or initiatives." The officer's eyebrows shot up. "I am sorry, but HOA rules are not enforceable by law enforcement, unless there's a direct violation of municipal, state, or federal law. We cannot intervene." I suppressed a smile, keeping my composure while internally reveling in the moment. Karen, clearly unprepared for this response, shifted her weight nervously. Her usual confidence, which had intimidated neighbors for years, was starting to crumble. "Perhaps there's a misunderstanding," I said politely, speaking directly to the officers while keeping my tone calm. "I have complied with all legal requirements regarding my property. The HOA does not have the authority to dictate where I live or which committees I choose to participate in. I respect their guidelines as suggestions, but nothing more. Karen's lips pressed together. I could see the internal gears turning. She had underestimated me and overestimated her power. I had remained calm, professional, and respectful, and yet her plan to intimidate me with the presence of police officers had backfired spectacularly. One officer nodded slowly, taking out a notepad. We can advise that the HOA handle their concerns internally. They do not have legal authority over residents beyond what is stipulated in municipal codes or property laws. As long as there's no violation of law, there's nothing we can enforce. Karen's face turned a shade redder, the color of someone who knows they have lost. She opened her mouth to speak but hesitated, realizing she had no legal footing. No real power here beyond social pressure. I decided to maintain the upper hand without humiliation. Karen, I said, keeping my voice neutral. I understand your desire for community cohesion, but it's not something I can participate in beyond what's legally required. I hope you can respect that. Involving law enforcement for matters they cannot enforce does not strengthen your position, it weakens it. The officers, relieved to have clarity, nodded again and stepped back. One of them muttered under their breaths, perhaps more to Karen than to me. These HOA disputes are getting out of hand. It was a sentiment I silently agreed with. HOA Karen had turned a simple disagreement into a spectacle that involved the police for no reason whatsoever. Karen, sensing the collapse of her plan, tried one last tactic. Well, perhaps we can come to a compromise. I just want what's best for the community. She leaned closer, her eyes narrowing slightly, attempting a more persuasive approach now that her initial intimidation had failed. I shook my head gently. I appreciate your concern, but my decisions are my own. Cooperation must be voluntary, and any enforcement beyond the law is outside the scope of what you can demand.
This is completely unacceptable. I warned you about the consequences. You were supposed to handle this, and now look at the mess we're in.
Her shoulders, usually rigid with self-assuredness, slumped just slightly. Her lips, which had previously formed a tight line of authority, quivered imperceptibly. This was a woman realizing that her tactics, honed over years to pressure and control neighbors, had just encountered someone who couldn't be moved by fear or social manipulation. As the officers began to step away, Karen's desperation became palpable. I could see it in the way she clutched her clipboard, as if it were a shield protecting her from the reality of failure. She had imagined a scenario where she could summon the police, and I would immediately capitulate, nodding, signing forms, and submitting to her control. Instead, she was left standing alone on my driveway, facing the very person she sought to intimidate, and utterly powerless. I remained calm, even friendly, as the officers started their departure. Thank you for clarifying, I said politely. I am glad we could resolve this misunderstanding without escalation. Karen, however, couldn't accept defeat gracefully. She muttered something under her breath, something like, "This isn't over," before storming off toward the neighborhood entrance. I watched her go, noting the way her usual aura of authority had evaporated in the presence of facts, legalities, and calm confidence. Once she was out of sight, I took a deep breath and let myself relax. This encounter had been tense, no doubt, but it also highlighted a critical truth. Intimidation only works if you allow it to. By maintaining composure, knowing my rights, and addressing the situation without anger or panic, I had turned Karen's plan against her. The unplanned call to the cops, which she had expected to be a hammer, ended up being a mirror. It reflected her lack of legal authority, her overreach, and her inability to control someone who refused to be manipulated. The officers left with a polite nod, perhaps silently questioning the sanity of HOA Karen's relentless campaigns, and I was left standing in my driveway, victorious in a way that didn't require confrontation, only clarity and confidence. Later, neighbors would whisper about the incident, Some would commend me quietly, while others would gossip about Karen's overzealous tactics. But I didn't need validation. The lesson was clear. Power is only as real as the fear it inspires. And Karen had just realized that the wrong person was standing in her way. She had escalated to law enforcement, expecting compliance. And instead, she had met someone who knew the rules, understood authority, and refused to be bullied. That morning marked a turning point. Karen had been forced to recalibrate her approach. Her carefully constructed image of dominance shattered in front of the very people she sought to impress. And while she would undoubtedly continue her attempts to assert control, she now knew one thing for certain. Not everyone is intimidated by a perfectly ironed blouse, a clipboard, or the illusion of authority. Some of us carry our own badge, the kind that commands respect, not fear. The unplanned call to the cops had failed spectacularly. Karen had played her hand, and I had read it perfectly. It was a reminder that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it simply stands firm, waits, and lets the other person reveal their weakness. And Karen had revealed hers in ways she could never have anticipated. After the debacle with the unplanned police visit, I thought the worst of HOA Karen's theatrics was over. But as anyone familiar with these overbearing HOA figures knows, they rarely quit, they escalate. What she didn't understand was that I had a secret weapon she could never have anticipated. I had anticipated that one day, her insistence and intimidation might lead her to push things too far. And when that day came, I would be ready. The following week, Karen decided it was time for a more personal confrontation. I was outside, tending to a small vegetable garden I had planted at the edge of my driveway, a hobby I loved, and a way to enjoy the quiet mornings. I noticed her approaching from a distance, her strut deliberate, her expression a mixture of indignation and faux cordiality. She carried the familiar clipboard, which she seemed to clutch like a talisman of power, as if mere possession could bend reality to her will. "Good mornings," she called, her voice annoyingly cheerful. "I just wanted to follow up on our previous discussion regarding your participation in the lakefront community initiatives." I looked up, putting down my trowels, and smiled politely. "Good mornings, Karen. I assume this is another visit to ensure compliance." Her smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. "I just want to make sure you understand the importance of community spirit," she said, her tone light, yet carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of authority. "We like to have everyone on the same page. It makes life easier for all of us." I nodded, as if indulging her, while mentally preparing for what was about to come. "Of course," I replied, keeping my tone calm and neutral. I always strive to respect my neighbors and maintain harmony in the community. That's when Karen decided to press harder. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, though in a way that suggested she expected me to be intimidated. "I've spoken with the board, and they are concerned about your lack of formal involvement. Living near the lake comes with responsibilities, and it's unusual that you haven't agreed to participate." I sighed softly, as if indulging a child throwing a tantrum. "Karen, I am aware of the community's expectations," I said gently. "However, I make decisions based on my own circumstances and priorities. I cannot commit to something just because it is expected by someone else, even if that someone carries a clipboard and wears pearls." Her expression shifted, a flash of frustration crossing her face. She had anticipated resistance. Yes, but she had not anticipated calm, polite, and completely unshaken defiance. Karen's thrived on fear, on hesitation, on that subtle tremor in someone's voice that told her she had power. I had given her none. And then came the moment, the one that would change everything in the interaction. Karen took a step closer, clearly trying to dominate the space around her. "You know," she said, tilting her head as if offering advice, "it's easier for everyone if you just—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Cooperate." I met her gaze steadily and smiled, deliberately holding up a small leather wallet. I clicked it open and revealed the metallic shine of the badge inside. The sun glinted off it, making the letters sparkle with authority that Karen could no longer dismiss as trivial. "Karen," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I think we need to clarify something." I pointed at the badge. "I am not just another resident here. I am an officer, and this is my badge." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Karen's mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again. The words she had rehearsed, the threats she had plotted, the strategies she had meticulously devised, all of it evaporated in the sudden, undeniable presence of real authority. She froze, caught between disbelief and the instinct to retreat. The police officers she had called a week ago had been external enforcers who ultimately had no grounds to intervene. But now, the badge I displayed wasn't a suggestion, a referral, or a social pretense. It was real. It carried weights, legalities, and consequences. And Karen's, despite all her confidence, could not summon the bravado to face it. "Officer," she began, her voice faltering. I didn't need her to finish the sentence. Her tone, her body language, her wide-eyed stare all spoke volumes. She had never anticipated encountering someone whose authority surpassed hers. Someone she could not intimidate. Someone whose words carried the tangible power of law and order, not social coercion. I took a step forward, keeping my expression neutral but assertive. "Karen, I understand your concerns about community participation. However, your efforts to pressure me into compliance are unnecessary. I respect the community, and I abide by the laws. Beyond that, your expectations have no enforceable authority here." Her lips pressed together. She looked down at the badge, then back at me, and I could see her mind racing. She was trying to process what she had just witnessed. Her mental script, perfected over years of HOA dominance, had no lines prepared for someone who wielded genuine authority instead of a clipboard and social leverage. Karen's typical tactics of intimidation, passive aggression, and social manipulation suddenly seemed absurd. She had relied on the illusion of power calls to law enforcement, whispered complaints, committee pressure to achieve compliance. But I had demonstrated clearly and unambiguously that the rules she tried to enforce were irrelevant in the face of legal authority. The silence between us stretched, heavy and almost tangible. I maintained a calm posture, allowing the weight of the moment to settle fully on her. In that silence, she realized that her previous victories in the neighborhood were irrelevant here. Her threats, her attempts at coercion, and her strategic calls to the cops all meaningless against the badge I now held up like a shield and a statement. Finally, Karen managed a weak, strained attempt at a sentence. I wasn't aware," she stammered. Her voice trailed off, lacking conviction. The power she had tried to wield over me had evaporated, leaving her exposed. I smiled politely. "Now you know," I said simply. "Let us proceed with clarity and respect, rather than intimidation." Karen took a step back, her body language betraying her surrender. She had nothing left to argue. Her eyes, which had previously sparkled with superiority and condescension, now flickered with a mix of shock, embarrassment, and reluctant acknowledgments. It was clear she had not just lost this confrontation, she had never even been in the right position to challenge me in the first place. Even after she backed away, I could see her mind working frantically. She was trying to figure out how to save face, how to explain to the HOA board that her attempts to dominate had failed spectacularly. I almost felt a twinge of sympathy but only briefly. This moment, the badge reveal, was a turning point. Karen's overconfidence had led her to miscalculate completely, underestimating the authority and composure of the person she sought to intimidate. She had assumed that fear, social pressure, and illusionary authority would suffice. Instead, She was confronted with reality, real authorities, real consequences, and someone unshakable in the face of her antics. By maintaining composure, showing patience, and revealing my badge at the precise moment, I didn't just win a confrontation, I redefined the dynamics of our interactions. Karen would never again approach me with the same smug certainty, never again assume compliance, and never again wield the illusion of power over me without considering the very real authority I represented. The moment lingered in the air, the kind of silence that carries weight beyond words. Karen shuffled her papers, adjusted her clothing, and muttered something about misunderstandings, though the words rang hollow even to her own ears. I nodded politely, keeping my badge visible just enough to reinforce the point without aggression. In the end, the badge reveal wasn't about intimidation. It was about clarity, legality, and assertion of boundaries. It was a statement that power, real powers, is recognized, respected, and understood. Karen's entire arsenal of HOA strategies, gossip, calls, social pressure, and committees was ineffective in the face of truth and authority. As she walked away, retreating down the street with her clipboard clutched like a failed weapon, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. The HOA ultimatum had escalated. The cops had been involved, and yet all of it paled in comparison
This is
to the
completely
clarity that came
unacceptable.
with the
I
badge
warned you about
reveal.
the consequences.
In
You were
that
supposed to
moment,
handle this, and now look at the mess we're
Karen's
in.
frozen shock became a lesson. Real authority, calm confidence, and knowledge of one's rights trumped fear, social pressure, and overreach every single time. That day, the neighborhood learned something important, not about the HOA, not about committees, and not about social hierarchies, but about the boundaries of power and the unexpected ways it can manifest. Karen's assumptions about control had been shattered, and I had done so without raising my voice, without aggression, and without a single violation of law or decorum. The badge had spoken, and its message was unambiguous. Authority, when legitimate and calmly wielded, cannot be ignored or bullied. The moment my badge gleamed in the sunlight, the scene changed completely. What had started as a routine confrontation with HOA Karen turned into something far more profound, an encounter in which the balance of power shifted entirely, leaving her utterly unprepared. Her eyes widened, and the perfectly controlled smile that had adorned her face for years vanished in an instant. In its place, a frozen expression took hold, one that revealed disbelief, fear, and the dawning realization that she had grossly miscalculated her position. For years, Karen had relied on a specific playbook. She knew exactly how to intimidate neighbors, how to subtly undermine anyone who didn't align with her version of community perfection. She had mastered the art of coercion through social pressure, gossip, committee control, and a relentless presence that reminded residents they were being watched. People feared her not because of any legal authority, but because she projected the illusion of power convincingly enough that most caved. But she had never encountered someone like me. The moment I displayed my badge, everything changed. The power she had assumed was absolute, the imagined weight of her committees, her rules, her neighborhood status was revealed as fragile. She was suddenly confronted with real authority. Authority grounded not in perception but in law, training, and undeniable legitimacy. And Karen's, as it turned out, had no experience dealing with such a reality. Her initial reaction was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. A slight pause in her breath, a brief step back as if trying to gain distance from the object that represented true power. But then the transformation became dramatic. Her eyes, which had always conveyed certainty and dominance, now darted nervously between me, the badge, and the street. Her hands, which had clutched the clipboard with such confidence moments before, twitched slightly, betraying the panic she tried to hide. The woman who had so confidently dictated rules to neighbors was now frozen in her tracks, unable to articulate even the simplest thought. Karen attempted to speak, but the words stumbled out in fragments, Lie. I didn't tea. I means, she stammered. A sound so foreign coming from someone who usually spoke with unwavering control. The forcefulness she had wielded over the neighborhood dissolved instantly. Her usual cadence, the carefully constructed tone of authority, collapsed under the weight of real power she could not comprehend or counter. She had not prepared for this. Her mind raced frantically, searching for a strategy, any strategy, to regain control. But there was none. All her tactics, threats, intimidation, social manipulation were meaningless now. The badge was more than a piece of metal. It was a statement, a declaration that she could not override. Manipulate, or bullies, and Karens, who had prided herself on her ability to bend people to her will, realized for the first time that someone had the upper hand. Her body language mirrored her mental state perfectly. She shifted from foot to foot, crossed her arms nervously, and then uncrossed them again, unsure whether to appear aggressive or submissive. She leaned forward slightly, then recoiled, caught in an internal tug of war between pride and fear. Every inch of her posture screamed uncertainty. The frozen expression was not just shock, it was the visible manifestation of a person confronted with their own limitations. I kept my own posture neutral, calm, unsteady, knowing that any sign of impatience or aggression could give her an opportunity to regain composure. I spoke softly but firmly. Karen, I understand your concerns about community involvement. I said, keeping the tone conversational, not confrontational. However, attempts to coerce participation through intimidation are unnecessary. I abide by the law and respect the community. But beyond that, my choices are my own. Her response was a nearly inaudible mutter. Lie. I just... She began, then stopped, realizing that there was nothing she could say that would restore the balance of control. She was trapped in a cognitive dissonance, the mental conflict that occurs when someone confronts undeniable reality contrary to their assumptions. She had assumed power, and the truth had rendered that assumption meaningless. The neighborhood itself seemed to hold its breath. A few curious neighbors peeked from behind curtains or through slightly open doors, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. In most HOA disputes, Karen was the clear authority, the woman who dictated terms without question. But now, for the first time, the spectators could witness the collapse of her carefully constructed image. Karen's frozen reaction was a spectacle of humility, embarrassment, and stunned disbelief. And it was impossible to ignore. I could see her mind attempting various escape strategies. Maybe claim misunderstanding. Maybe accuse me of exaggeration. Maybe attempt some sort of procedural manipulation. But each scenario faltered before it even formed fully, because she had no real authority to leverage. Her usual arsenal was powerless against someone who wielded actual power, grounded in legality and procedure. Time seemed to stretch in that moment. Karen's face reflected layers of emotion. Panic, shame, confusion, and a subtle but undeniable fear. Her eyes darted around, as if seeking allies, witnesses, or any sort of external validation that could somehow reverse the scenario. But the neighborhood, silent and observant, offered no immediate reinforcement for her, leaving her stranded in the very vulnerability she had long feared exposing. Her voice finally returned, trembling and tentative. Lie. I don't tea. I means. She trailed off, staring at the badge, staring at me, then back at the ground. She had no words that could assert dominance or recover her composure. She had never been in a situation where someone stood unwavering, calmly, and refused to yield to fear or social pressure. I remained calm, projecting the kind of steady authority that Karen had never encountered before. My body language, tone, and measured words reinforced the message. This was my space, my rules, my authorities. The badge, visible in my hand, was a tangible symbol of power she could neither deny nor challenge. Every second that passed deepened her shock, solidifying her frozen state. Karen's reaction was compounded by the psychological realization of loss of control. She had long thrived on perceived power, on bending situations to her favor, on ensuring that everyone conformed to her expectations. That she was now powerless in my presence was not just a minor inconvenience, it was a complete disruption of her worldview. She had built a self-image around dominance and control, and this encounter exposed the fragility of that image in a very public and undeniable way. Even when she attempted to regain composure, adjusting her posture and straightening her blouse, the freeze lingered. Her hands fidgeted, her gaze wandered, and she hesitated with every word. This was the body language of someone caught off guard, someone whose mental scripts had failed, someone who realized that previous strategies were inadequate in the face of real authority. I spoke again, softly but firmly, giving her space to process. Karen, there's no need to escalate or overcomplicate this. The community is valuable. The lake is beautiful, and I respect its residents. But attempts to enforce compliance through intimidation are unnecessary. We can move forward with mutual respect, understanding, and clarity. Her frozen reaction softened slightly into a hesitant nod, though it was clear that internally, she was still grappling with disbelief. The frozen moment stretched for what felt like an eternity, until finally, she took a step back, muttered something about needing to reconsider, and began to retreat down the driveway. Every movement was hesitant, every glance backward filled with the unmistakable realization that her previous dominance had been nullified. As she receded, I allowed myself a small, subtle smile. Karen's shock and frozen reaction had achieved more than mere victory in a personal confrontation. It had symbolically dismantled the power dynamics she had relied upon for years. Her assumptions about intimidation, fear, and control were no longer effective. Her frozen moment was a testament to the fact that authority, when legitimate and calmly wielded, cannot be intimidated or coerced by illusionary power. The neighborhood itself seemed to sense the shift. People who had quietly observed previous HOA disputes were now witnesses to a rare phenomenon: the collapse of a social authority figure when confronted with real, measured power. Karen's frozen reaction was not just personal humiliation, it was a cautionary spectacle demonstrating that overreach and intimidation can fail when met with knowledge, calmness, and legitimate authority. By the time Karen disappeared from view, the impact of her frozen reaction lingered. She had underestimated the situation, overestimated her control, and faced an undeniable truth that she could neither manipulate nor ignore. Her shock was complete, her mental scripts inoperative, and her authority, at least in this encounter, effectively neutralized. That day, the frozen reaction of HOA Karen became a story in itself, one that would resonate not only with those who witnessed it, but also with anyone who understands the delicate interplay between perceived power and real authority. Her shock was more than immediate. It was transformative, teaching a lesson that reverberated far beyond our brief interaction. After the unforgettable showdown with HOA Karen, it was time to step back and assess what had truly happened. The conflict, which had started as a simple dispute over lakefront community participation, had escalated to a point where she had called law enforcement, attempted intimidation, and faced her own frozen shock when confronted with real authority. But in the midst of all the drama, I realized something essential. Victory didn't need to be loud, violent, or destructive. It could be achieved through composure, strategy, and the careful exercise of knowledge and power. The morning after Karen's frozen reaction, I woke up with a quiet sense of satisfaction. The neighborhood was calm, the lake glimmered in the sunlight, and the air smelled of pine and freshly mown grass. Karen had retreated, unsure of how to proceed after being confronted by someone she could neither intimidate nor manipulate. Her attempts to assert dominance had failed, not because of confrontation or aggression, but because of clear boundaries, patience, and the understanding of one's own rights and authority. I spent the next few days maintaining a low profile. I knew that in situations like this, Overreaction could give the other party leverage. Even after a defeat, Karen was cunning, and though she had been momentarily frozen, she was unlikely to disappear entirely. She might attempt to rally neighbors, draft letters, or find some loophole to reclaim her sense of power. But I was prepared. I had already anticipated her potential moves and knew that the key to long-term victory lay in demonstrating authority without resorting to conflict. It became clear quickly that Karen's usual tactics, flyers, whispers, social pressure, were now ineffective. Neighbors, who had often been influenced by her confidence and social dominance, began to see the reality of the situation. Karen's failure to assert control in the presence of actual authority, combined with her visible shock and hesitation, shifted the neighborhood's perception. People who had once feared or deferred to her now viewed her attempts at intimidation as overblown and, frankly, ridiculous. One afternoon, I walked near the lake with a few neighbors, discussing community maintenance and shared spaces. Karen attempted to approach, clipboard in hand, trying to assert some form of dominance through casual small talk. But this time, there was no fear, no hesitation from anyone present. She spoke, but her words felt hollow, lacking the conviction and control she had always relied upon. The contrast between her usual authority and the subdued, cautious manner she now displayed was stark. It was the visible effect of being confronted with a person who operated from legitimate power and calm composure rather than theatrics. Throughout these encounters, I remained courteous but firm. I didn't need to shout, threaten, or escalate the situation further. I had achieved what I needed. Karen understood that I could not be coerced, and the neighborhood saw the futility of her usual tactics. Victory, in this sense, was not about humiliation or revenge. It was about the quiet establishment of boundaries, the demonstration of knowledge, and the reinforcement of authority. I also documented interactions carefully, ensuring that if Karen attempted to misrepresent events, there would be a clear record. Every conversation, every visit, every interaction was noted, not out of paranoia, but as a prudent measure. It wasn't about confrontation, it was about preparation and clarity, which are essential elements of achieving victory without creating unnecessary conflict. Interestingly, Karen's frozen reaction and her subsequent retreat created a subtle shift in the entire community. Neighbors who had once deferred to her judgment began seeking guidance elsewhere, discussing matters openly and critically rather than following blindly. Karen's attempts at social dominance, once so effective, had inadvertently fostered an environment where independent thought and careful evaluation became more valued. Without intending to, I had helped create a small but significant cultural shift in the neighborhood, a community less reliant on intimidation and more grounded in fairness, clarity, and mutual respect. Even in private interactions, I maintained the same principle. When Karen attempted to speak, I listened politely, acknowledged her points, and then reiterated my boundaries clearly and calmly. There was no need for aggression or confrontation. The badge, my knowledge of rights, and my unwavering composure were sufficient. By refusing to escalate, I allowed Karen to understand that the conflict was not worth pursuing further, and that her previous tactics were ineffective. This approach reinforced the idea that real victory is often silent, strategic, and composed rather than loud and forceful. Over the weeks, Karen's activity diminished. She no longer made surprise visits or issued thinly veiled threats. The HOA's attempts to pressure me through procedural avenues were met with polite but firm resistance, and it became apparent that without coercion or fear to leverage, there was little she could do. The community began returning to normal, but with a renewed understanding of boundaries, authority, and respect. Karen remained a presence, but her attempts at intimidation had lost their potency. Victory, I realized, was not just about the immediate confrontation. It was about establishing a precedent, creating a situation where further attempts at manipulation would be ineffective. Karen had learned, as had the neighborhood, that coercion and social intimidation have limits that are quickly revealed when confronted by knowledge, authority, and calm determination. I had achieved my goal without ever resorting to conflict or aggression, demonstrating that the most effective victories often come from strategy, foresight, and restraint. This approach also reinforced my own sense of personal power. I didn't need to escalate the situation, retaliate, or humiliate Karen to assert my boundaries. By maintaining calm, clarity, and authority, I ensured that the resolution was sustainable and respected by all parties involved. It was a victory not only over HOA Karen's attempts to intimidate, but also over the stress and uncertainty that often accompany such confrontations. By handling the situation strategically, I preserved both my peace of mind and my autonomy. In retrospect, the conflict with Karen taught several important lessons about power, authority, and human behaviors. Attempts to intimidate, coerce, or manipulate can be effective only when the target is unaware, uncertain, or compliant. When faced with knowledge, authority, and composure, even the most confident attempts at domination can crumble. Victory, therefore, is not always about fighting harder, it's about being smarter, prepared, and unwavering in one's principles. The final, perhaps most satisfying, aspect of this victory without violence was the impact on the neighborhood. By standing firm, calmly, and strategically, I had shown not only Karen, but also the community that intimidation and social pressure are not infallible tools. Neighbors observed the dynamic and, in subtle ways, adopted a more measured approach to HOA interactions themselves. It was a shift toward mutual respect, awareness of legal boundaries, and recognition that real authority cannot be mimicked or fabricated. As weeks turned into months, the lakefront community regained a sense of normalcy. Karen's energy was redirected into routine HOA activities, but without the intensity and intimidation she had once wielded over neighbors. The neighborhood had been reminded of the limits of authority, the importance of boundaries, and the power of calm, strategic action. My victory had been quiet, effective, and enduring, proving that one does not need aggression, force, or spectacle to win. Reflecting on the entire ordeal, I realized that the essence of victory without violence lies in clarity, preparation, and composure. By knowing my rights, maintaining calm, and strategically revealing authority when necessary, I had neutralized an overbearing antagonist without escalating conflict. Karen's frozen reaction, the police involvement, and the eventual retreat had all underscored a critical truth. Intimidation only works when you allow it, and true power is recognized, respected, and effective precisely because it does not rely on fear alone. Ultimately, the story of HOA Karen and the lakefront confrontation became more than a personal victory. It became an example of strategic assertiveness, of standing firm without aggression, and of achieving goals with intelligence and foresight. Victory, as I had learned, can be both decisive and peaceful, effective and enduring, all without raising a hand or raising a voice. It is in that balance between authority and restraint, between clarity and patience that true triumph resides.